During his period in the White House, H.R. McMaster was instrumental in bringing about one of the most profound changes in US foreign policy since the Cold War, with what's now become known as the new China policy. That makes his book Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, an extremely valuable contribution to discussion in these delicate times. And I'm delighted that Lieutenant General McMaster has been able to make time to join us today from Northern California, where he's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. Welcome to this great AmCham Menzies Research Centre event, Lieutenant General.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, April. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you.
HR, your book was keenly awaited by the President's enemies and supporters alike, both hoping for ammunition in the run-up to the election. Tell me, are you here to bury Caesar or to praise him?
Well, I guess neither, Nick. I do write in the author's note in the preface that this is not the book that it seemed like everybody wanted me to write, right? And those who were in favor of the president wanted me to write that, you know, he was a visionary who had changed American foreign policy for the better, and others who were against the president wanted me to write, you know, he's the bigoted narcissist, you know, who is a danger to the country and the world. But, you know, Nick, I mean, as we've been at each other's throats in the United States, from a partisan political perspective, none of these challenges have gone away. And what I hope that the book will do is bring readers together across the free world so we can have a meaningful discussion about these challenges and decide what we have to do together to build a better future for generations to come. And of course, you know, I don't hesitate to criticize Trump administration policies in the book, as I don't hesitate to criticize other administration's policies. But I think it's really important for us at this point, within America, but really across the free world, to come together and to work together much more effectively.
Can I take you to Russia and to Vladimir Putin? A colleague of yours at the Hudson Institute, Peter Robinson, summed up your view of Putin as being a cross between an old school czar and Tony Soprano. Is that accurate?
Well, you know, Vladimir Putin, of course, comes from the KGB. He is an operator, and as I describe him in the book, and what I think is most important to understand about Vladimir Putin are the emotions and the ideology that drives his behavior. In particular, I describe Putin as a man who is suffering from a sense of honor lost with the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War, and so therefore he is determined to restore Russia to national greatness. He is, of course, cognizant of the fact that he doesn't really have the resources necessary to compete with the Western world, with us head to head. And so what he's determined to do is to drag all of us down, particularly in Europe and the United States, to polarize our societies, to pit us against each other, to reduce our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And so he is engaged in a sustained campaign of what I describe as disruption, disinformation, and denial against us. And so it's very important, I think, for us to be able to understand what motivates him, so we disabuse ourselves of this illusion that we're going to have a better relationship with him and he's going to fundamentally change his behavior.
We know that the Russians were heavily involved in trying to influence the last election, 2016. How heavily involved were they, and how heavily are they involved this time around?
Well, they were very heavily involved. And what I do in Battlegrounds is I tell the story of the interference in the election in context of this sustained campaign of political subversion. And what the Russians want to do in the context of the election is divide Americans on any issue that is already divisive. So, for example, in 2016, about 80% of the bot and troll traffic from the Internet Research Agency was aimed at issues of race, appropriating websites and organizations in a way that drove Americans toward polar extremes. A distant second was on issues of immigration, and also in the lesser category was the issue of gun control, for example. And so I think that we got a lot better. I was partly responsible for us improving our ability to defend against this campaign of subversion and against election interference. And I think that Americans should be very confident in the security of their election system. There have been a lot of new standards put in place, working with our very decentralized system at the state level to ensure that election results cannot be tampered with. And then I think very, very importantly, we changed some of the authorities associated with our cyber forces in recognition of the fact, Nick, that you can't have a good cyber defense without a good offense. And there was a dramatic shift, I think, in effectiveness downward by the Internet Research Agency and Russia in the 2018 elections. And I feel confident about the 2020 elections, except, I just wish we'd stop being our own worst enemies, Nick, because we play into their hands with, how divided we've become in America. And then what I write about in Battlegrounds is the tendency of both parties to compromise principle for partisan expediency. And I think we have to transcend this partisanship and work together as Americans.
One of the big themes of your book is strategic narcissism. It's the way you diagnose Australia's or America's current position, the tendency to view the world only in relation to the United States and to assume that the future course of events depends primarily on US decisions and plans. How did that strategic narcissism arise, and what's its consequences?
I think you might argue that it's always been a problem in America. America tends to be very optimistic and to think that, hey, eventually the world's going to come around to the way that America does things and to our system and so forth. But I think the problem became particularly acute in the post-Cold War period. And of course, we had reason to be confident in the post-Cold War period with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the lopsided military victory over Saddam Hussein's army in Iraq, for example. But I think that optimism in the 1990s led to complacency, and it led to broad acceptance of what are clearly, in retrospect, fundamentally flawed assumptions about the so-called New World Order. First of all, that ideological competition was a relic of the past. Great power competition was passé. And then, of course, this belief in this revolution in military affairs that gave our advanced Western militaries a tremendous technological differential advantage that guaranteed our security. And so I think it was a setup, Nick. This was a setup for shocks and disappointments in the 2000s, the mass murder attacks, certainly of 9/11, during which terrorists bypassed our military prowess with box cutters and airplanes, killing nearly 3,000 innocents. And then the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then, of course, the financial crisis. And then that shook our confidence, I believe. And that emotional impetus behind policy shifted from overconfidence to pessimism and resignation. And I think both forms of either underestimating the costs and risks of action, I think invasion of Iraq in 2003 is a case in point, or underappreciating the risks and costs of inaction and disengagement, such as the complete withdrawal of Iraq in December of 2011, or decisions not to act in a way that could have constrained and ameliorated the humanitarian crisis in Syria, especially the unenforced red line, are examples of strategic narcissism. And of course, the problem with defining the world only in relation to you is you're not considering the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that others have, especially your rivals, adversaries, and enemies.
So on that point, can I take you to perhaps the most egregious example of our wishful thinking, wanting to see the world in our terms rather than it actually is, and that's China, the country that refuses to play by our script. We used to think, I was the correspondent in the early 90s, and we still thought that even post-Tiananmen, that economic opening up would eventually lead to some form of liberal democracy. That hasn't happened, and you've been responsible, I think, for helping to change attitudes in the American administration on that. Tell me about it.
I was obviously determined not to make the same mistakes that I had identified in national security decision-making and policy-making during the Vietnam period in a previous book entitled Dereliction of Duty. One of those pitfalls I found was that Americans during this period of time in Lyndon Johnson's administration rushed to action, right? Just get some bombing runs off, get the first troops deployed, and we'll figure it out later. So we put into place a process in which we held a framing session. We applied design thinking to these first order challenges that we were facing. And part of that framing was to understand these challenges on their own terms, to apply what I call in the book, and a term I borrow from the historian Zachary Short, strategic empathy, the ability in particular to understand better what drives and constrains the other, especially emotions and ideology. And as we convened this principals committee framing session on China, I read a couple of excerpts from previous China policies and just made the observation that we were about to effect the biggest shift in US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, because we were now making what was the implicit assumption that underpinned those policies explicit, testing it and finding it to be false. And that's the assumption that China, having been welcomed in to the international order, would play by the rules, would as it prospered, liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. It was painfully clear by 2017 that that was not the case. And so we replaced those assumptions with a new set of assumptions, and we shifted the strategy from cooperation and engagement to competition. I know Australia has been an extremely strong partner with us on this. The recent Quad ministerial in Tokyo is an example of that. You know, I often point to John Garneau's groundbreaking work on Chinese influence in Australia, and how that work inspired a great deal of other very important investigative journalist efforts around the world, including in the U.S. So I think the free world is coming to its senses on this, Nick. I think it took longer than it should have, but I think now we recognize the danger that China poses to its own people, certainly, with this campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang, the extension of the party's arm of repression into Hong Kong, but increasingly how the party is now exporting this authoritarian mercantilist model in a much more aggressive way through programs like One Belt, One Road, how programs like military civil fusion are meant to gain a differential advantage, not only in the emerging data-driven economy, but also militarily. And then this program of Made in China 2025, which includes a sustained campaign of industrial espionage. So I think we're awake to these threats now. It is a very dangerous time right now. We can talk more about that, I guess, if you like, because I think in many ways, COVID-19 has catalyzed many of these challenges in Battlegrounds and this challenge associated with the Chinese Communist Party in particular.
How would you feel about an Australian state joining up to Belt and Road? Because that has happened, the state of Victoria. Is that something that should alarm us a little or alarm us a lot?
I think it should alarm you a lot, because these great deals come with strings attached. You can really get quite a bit at a discount from China, especially in the area of telecommunications. But the price for that is, of course, that you're transferring your data to Beijing. And I think it's unrealistic, Nick, to expect the Chinese Communist Party to treat our citizens better than they treat their own people. And so I think that I would make sure you look very carefully at the terms of the agreement. Certainly, I think in Australia, with the degree of transparency and rule of law that you have, it wouldn't be as great of a risk, I would think, as it is with other countries in which the vanguard of the new vanguard of the Chinese Communist Party arrives in the form of a party official accompanied by a national bank official with duffel bags of cash, to spread around, to buy influence, and then to indebt those countries beyond what they can service, so they can create servile relationships. The strings that come attached, obviously, Nick, are those involving the expectation that you will support the Chinese Communist Party's foreign policy. I write about this in the book as a campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment. And of course, there are many examples of this, of states that are coerced to support the party's policies and the repression of its own people. But companies as well. I mean, the National Basketball Association in the U.S. just being one of the more dramatic and recent examples of that.
Let's stay in North Asia and just make a side trick, if you like, to the Korean Peninsula. So you were, if I understand you right from the book, you were a little bit skeptical about the idea of a summit between President Trump and his counterpart in North Korea, but you thought that Trump was such a sort of unconventional character, something might just come out of it. So in hindsight, where did that get us?
Well, it really got us, I think, nowhere, but it didn't make the situation worse. I think because that the Trump administration adhered to the principles that we established at the outset, that we meant to underpin a sustained foreign policy approach toward North Korea, and that policy approach is really based on this testing this thesis, Nick, that we can convince Kim Jong-un that he is less safe with the weapons than he is without them, and to do that through a campaign of maximum pressure. We were determined, not to repeat the failed pattern of previous efforts, and in particular, just to give concessions up front, for the privilege of talking to the North Koreans and to make payoffs and so forth. This is, I think, what frustrated Kim in Hanoi. He was expecting that same kind of behavior, didn't get it, and the summit failed. And I think for good reason, and we should celebrate the failure of that summit. I think what's important now, though, is to continue to marshal international support for increasing the pressure on North Korea. As you know, the regime is under some significant pressure now. It's really hard to tell, right? Because it's hard to really see across the 38th parallel with any degree of clarity. But, the country, I think, has probably more than 0 COVID cases, which is what Kim Jong-un claims. The country's been ravaged by floods. The COVID-19 effect of shutting down trade was maybe the best means of enforcing UN Security Council resolutions. And there are signs of increasing desperation on the part of the regime, in particular with the frenzied pace with which they're undertaking cyber criminal activity to generate revenue. So we could do a lot more. We could interdict more. We could impose costs, secondary sanctions, for example, on Chinese banks to facilitate illicit flows to North Korea. But I think it's worth testing this thesis, Nick, because a nuclear armed North Korea is a significant danger to the world, not just because of the possession of those weapons, but the effect on the non-proliferation regime, and just the fact that North Korea's never met a weapon it didn't try to sell to somebody, including its nuclear program to Syria, until the Israeli Defense Forces bombed that facility in 2007.
You speak of America's commitment problem. You describe it as a post-Vietnam emotional aversion to long-term military commitment. The consequences in Afghanistan, as you say, is that you've been fighting a 1-year war 20 times over. And in Iraq, you gave too little attention, I think, as everybody would acknowledge now in hindsight, to nation building. Can the US ever get away from the trauma of Vietnam and start doing these things properly?
Well, Nick, I think it even extends beyond earlier than Vietnam. This tendency on our part to believe really that the next war will be fundamentally different from all those that have come before it, and to neglect the importance of consolidating military gains to get to sustainable political outcomes in any other conflict other than just a raid, right? A raid is a military operation of short duration, limited purpose, and planned withdrawal. But Afghanistan wasn't a raid, because what we wanted to do was replace the Taliban with an Afghan government that was capable of ensuring that jihadist terrorists never again used that country, the territory, as a safe haven and support base to commit mass murder attacks against us. And on Iraq in 2003, we often debate, should we have done it? That may be useful, but I think it's more useful to debate who the heck thought it would be easy. Why did they think it would be easy? I think, Nick, that the prospects for us learning from these experiences are low, because I think we have learned the wrong lessons again. The lesson is, I think that, we should have just left instead of trying to shape the political outcome. Well, what would have happened then? I think it would have been an ugly scenario. I think it's paradoxically, and what I describe in the book, I hope in a way that's convincing, is that it was this short-term mentality that lengthened these wars, made them longer, made them more costly than they would have been otherwise. And so, nation building doesn't mean we're going to create countries in our own image. I mean, Afghanistan doesn't need to be Denmark, right? Afghanistan just needs to be Afghanistan. And I think that our impatience there really led to a whole series of problems, which I describe in more detail in the book.
Just although late breaking news, let's call it late breaking news from the Middle East. Broke too late for your book deadline. And that's the Abraham Accords, the deal between, or the normalization of relations between Israel, two two Gulf states, Bahrain, UAE, and the real thawing of relations with across the Arab world. This seems to me to be a game changer, but I'd like your assessment.
Well, Nick, I mean, it isn't very often when you have good news out of the Middle East, and we ought to take a moment to celebrate it, right? I think it is good news. And what I do write about in Battlegrounds is how the Arab monarchies, the Gulf states, have concluded really over time that their security interests align with those of Israel, and in large measure because of Iran's 40-year-long proxy war against the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan, Israel, and those Arab monarchies. And I think what's clear is that Iran is pursuing a hegemonic design in the region, and doing so by keeping the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in a sectarian civil war. It is the application then of this Hezbollah model that gives Iran a great deal of influence. This is where you have a weak government in power that is dependent on Iran for support, while Iran grows militias and illegal armed groups outside of that government's control, so they can be turned against that government if it acts against Iranian interests. You see that in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and it's what they're attempting to do in Yemen as well. Iran has also directly threatened these Gulf states, obviously, with support for essentially insurgent groups within Bahrain. That's a complicated issue, obviously, but then also the missile attacks, from Yemen, launched into Saudi Arabia, UAE, the shortest ship missiles employed off into the Bab el-Mandeb and so forth, and of course the effort to place a proxy army on the border of Israel as they reinforce Hezbollah with precision rockets. So I think it's a reflection of the alignment of the interests. But also, I think the Trump administration did a pretty good job with this and initiated it early. I think it's worth going back to the president's trip to Riyadh. And I'm sure everybody was scratching their heads like, what the heck is Donald Trump doing going to Saudi Arabia, right? And when you look at the speech that he gave and the speech that King Salman gave, that laid out really a vision for a fundamental shift in the relationship. Now, hey, there have been some big disappointments, right? With the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, for example, a journalist and a U.S. resident, and the way in which Mohammed bin Salman has extended and has consolidated his grip on power internally. Yes, but this vision was to change Saudi Arabia from the problem, a country that had been proselytizing an ideology of hatred and intolerance that was used to recruit jihadist terrorists, to radicalize young impressionable people into a force for good, into countering that ideology. And I think there's been some progress made on this, Nick. I think what the Abraham Accords do is two things. First of all, they signal to Iran, hey, thanks for pushing this all together. But it also signals to the Muslim world, to all of us, this is not a war of religion with these jihadist terrorist organizations. We are all people of the book, and this is a war against criminals who use a perverted interpretation of Islam to justify their criminal acts or to pursue political objectives. And I think that can go a long way, in terms of isolating these terrorist organizations from sources of ideological support. I think there are implications for the Palestinians, certainly. And I think that at some point in the future, hopefully, based on the evolution of Israeli domestic politics, but actually, the nature of the Palestinian Authority and the degree to which the Palestinian Authority can speak for all Palestinians, not only in the West Bank, but also in Gaza, that's a stretch. Prospects aren't good. So that's going to have to be, a challenge that is managed, I think, in the near term. But the Abraham Accords and this sort of outside-in approach to that, to that very difficult problem, I think progress ought to be celebrated.
HR, the title of your book, Battlegrounds, the fight to defend the free world. You've got that word free in there. The defense of the free world is how, previous presidents, Ronald Reagan during the Cold War, FDR during the Second World War, used to talk about the battle. And that seems to me from your book, we've got that battle on our hands again. But here's the question. You quote the late professor and philosopher Richard Rorty in your book as saying, national pride is to countries what self-respect is to individuals, a necessary condition for self-improvement. Do you think, given the partisan divide, the vitriol in American politics and to some extent in other democracies like our own. Is this sapping our national pride to such an extent that we will be unable to defend freedom?
Well, Nick, I think it's a grave danger. I really do. Now, this is not the first time Americans have been divided. This is not the first time that we've engaged in vitriolic partisan discourse. I mean, our history is rife with these examples. I think it's worth pointing out it's what our founders feared the most, right? In the Federalist Papers that really laid out the argument for our Constitution, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton wrote about the danger of factions and how factions could polarize us and pit us against each other. They had in mind the bloody wars in England in the 17th century, and saw that as the greatest danger to our republic. I think that they try to put in place mechanisms to prevent those dangers from occurring with separation of powers and so forth. We've been divided, very divided at times. It was only after the most destructive war in our history, our Civil War, that we emancipated 4 million Americans. We should celebrate that. We should celebrate, I think, the rights enshrined in our Declaration of Independence in the Constitution, but recognize it did take 100 years to remove that blight on our history of slavery. And then we entered another difficult period and a period of failure, of Reconstruction and the rise of the Jim Crow segregationist South and the Ku Klux Klan. But I think we can take pride in the progress in terms of equality of opportunity, especially that accomplishments that manifested themselves in the 1960s, associated with the civil rights movement and the dismantlement of de jure segregation and inequality of opportunity. But hey, we can still recognize, right, that we have a lot of work to do. We still have de facto inequality of opportunity. We have to work on education. There's so much, I write about this in the conclusion of the book, that we can work on together if we strengthen, I think, our common identity as Americans. What I'm seeing today, Nick, is this interaction between identity politics with bigotry and racism in a way that's creating these centripetal forces on the fringes that are spinning us faster and faster and tearing us apart from each other. I think history plays a role in this. We ought to take pride in our history, not a contrived, happy view of our history, but I think recognize the great gift that we have in democracies, that we do have a say in how we're governed. I think we should take pride in the fact that people want to immigrate to our countries. I mean, there aren't too many people trying to immigrate to China. And so I think that we should talk less about who we don't want in our countries and talk more about who we need to strengthen our countries in the area of immigration, for example. So America's been through these crises before. We've been able to emerge from them stronger. And I want to just do all I can to contribute to that cause. And I hope this book contributes to at least bring us together around issues of foreign policy.
Let me bring in Andrew Hastie, who's chair of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security and a former troop commander in the Special Air Services Regiment. Andrew.
Can I start by just reading a quote from a letter that's about 11 years old? If the history of Afghanistan is one great stage play, the United States is no more than a supporting actor among several previously in a tragedy that not only pits tribes, valleys, clans, villages and families against one another, but from at least the end of King Zahir Shah's reign has violently and savagely pitted the urban, secular, educated and modern of Afghanistan against the rural, religious, illiterate and traditional. It is this latter group that composes and supports the Pashtun insurgency. This was from a letter written by Matthew Ho, a US State Department official who resigned in 2009 while serving in Zabul province. I was there as a 26-year-old lieutenant, and that letter rang true to me then through what I was experiencing. It rang true in 2013, and it still rings true today. And I just would like to ask you, how long do we have to stay in Afghanistan, and what are the risks of leaving early?
Yeah. Well, I would just say thanks, Andrew, and thanks for your service in Zabul. I've been there a number of times. You were there at a very tough period of time, actually, during which we were intensifying operations against the Taliban after vacating a lot of that space under the assumption that that peace in the South was to be taken for granted, and it was our Australian forces, Canadian and British forces that really had to step up heavily during that period of time. So thanks for your service there. I think that the narrative is wrong Andrew, about Afghanistan, I think we already won, and we just don't know it. We don't talk about it that way. I think we don't want to cheapen the sacrifices of soldiers that are still taking risks and making sacrifices. For example, we had 10 U.S. soldiers make the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan this year. But I think it's worth pointing out that about 30 Afghan soldiers and police die every day fighting to preserve the freedoms that they've earned after the defeat of the Taliban or the removal of the Taliban in 2001. And I think what is tragic about what we've done now in Afghanistan is we've partnered with, as you mentioned, the 5 or 10% of the population that might be sympathetic to the Taliban or elements of the Taliban, certain tribes that are affiliated with the Taliban, against the 90% that want to have nothing to do with the Taliban because they remember, right? They remember what it was like from during the Civil War, but then especially from 96 to 2001. So, I think that we just went about it the wrong way. We thought we misconceived, really what our role would be there in an enduring basis. And I think we were down to quite a manageable level of effort in terms of, the size of the force and the expense and the sacrifices that our soldiers would be called on to make as Afghans increasingly are bearing the brunt of this fight. As you know, probably if you're tracking this closely, there's a major offensive going on in Helmand province now. This offensive would not have been possible if we had not entered into the agreement with the Taliban, an agreement in which, Andrew, we just gave up way too much. I mean, we just made concession after concession, right? And what we essentially did is force the Afghan government into a very difficult position in which they've really given up much of their leverage with the release of these 5,000 of the most heinous people on earth. And then the Taliban in Qatar, and I have this from friends who were there, Afghan friends who were there, what the Taliban's message is to the Afghans, why are we talking to you? We just defeated the world's greatest superpower. Who are you, right? And so what that does is beg the question then, Andrew, like what does power sharing with the Taliban look like? Is it mass executions in the soccer stadium every other Saturday? Is it every other girls' school bulldozed? Are we willing to just bear witness as bystanders to that? And of course, as we know, problems in that part of the world don't stay there. Whether it's jihadist terrorism or a virus for that matter. But I think that we're recreating in many ways the conditions that led to 9/11. This idea that you can have offshore counterterrorism operations. I mean, that's what we did in 1998, right? When we fired a few cruise missiles at Osama bin Laden and called it a day, right? And we know what happened just 3 years later. So, I mean, that's my argument, Andrew, is that we can, there are no short-term solutions to long-term problems. Right? We can't afford, and we don't have the will to do all this ourselves. We can't do it, right? But we can enable others who are willing to bear the brunt of these efforts.
Former Major General Jim Molan was the Chief of Operations for the new headquarters multinational force in Iraq. He's currently the Deputy Chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Interference through Social Media. Jim, I'm glad to see you on the call. What's your question?
Nick, thank you for that. And General, good to see you. For the last 75 years, we've really been a strategic free zone. You talk about strategic narcissism. I would see that as an absolute benefit for us when we don't have a national security strategy. But for those last 75 years, we've essentially lived off American power, and we've become extraordinarily prosperous and very, very secure. We now look at China, General, and we are very, very concerned about China, as is the world. And we look at Chinese military power and economic power, etc. But we fail to look at US power. And I've made the point often in Australia that we in Australia have fixed in the back of our minds, we don't have to do much because the Americans will always come to our aid. Their power is infinite. And I shared that view when I initially went to Iraq. I very much understand it's different now. General, I make the point that since the end of the Cold War, US military power, perhaps not in numbers, but in ability to do things, has decreased from 30 to 50%, from 2.5 wars back to 1 war and a hold in another war. And we know the reasons for that, but does that sit true with you? do you, am I safe in making that statement because it's critical to the impetus for us to develop our own strategy and resources?
Yeah. Well, Jim, this is a very important point, right? So power is relative, right? And military capabilities are relative. It's very clear that our power relative to the People's Liberation Army has decreased based, as you already alluded to, on these vast investments, over 800% increase in military spending since the mid-90s for the PLA. And I think what is concerning is that much of that increase has been pretty smart in terms of investing in capabilities that from the Chinese perspective, they think take away our differential advantages. And our differential advantage has been for quite some time our ability to integrate joint operations very effectively. And this is operations across all domains: land, sea, air, undersea, space, and cyberspace. And these disruptive capabilities include, as we've seen, anti-satellite capabilities, offensive cyber capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities, long-range missiles and hypersonic missiles that pose a threat to surface targets and warships, tiered and layered air defense, right? So they didn't invest big into stealth like us. They didn't build nuclear submarines and multiple aircraft carriers. And I think they invested wisely in some of these capabilities. So we're in a situation now where we have a problem associated with modernization, because we need to modernize to counter those counters. And then also, we're at a relative strategic disadvantage because we have vacated some of our forward positioned locations. I'd say the Philippines, in particular, has put us in a position of disadvantage. It was a period because really it's important, I think, to realize, and I mean you know this better than anybody, that China is trying to deny us freedom of movement and action, and create areas of primacy that are exclusionary across the Indo-Pacific region. What they have in mind is a new version of the tributary system, with China at the center. To counter this, at least from a military perspective, forward positioned, capable coalition forces, and I'm talking now about the U.S. and Australia in particular as treaty allies, it changes that dynamic instantly from denied space to contested space, because you're already there. And so I think that some of these new tactics that the Marine Corps is experimenting with, for example, the ability to project power across multiple domains, which is now our doctrine, all of that is useful. It all applies within our alliance as well. So we have a problem of modernization, which was going to require investment to reduce our vulnerabilities to these capabilities. I think the U.S. withdrawal from the INF Treaty because of Russia's violation of that treaty, this is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, was a very positive development as applied to the Indo-Pacific as well, because China has, as you know, invested in these intermediate range missiles in a way that did give them kind of an anti-access capability. So I think that many of our trends are in the right direction. But what we have to do primarily is deter the PLA, deter them by denial, which means that they're kept by their calculations, they will be unable to accomplish their objectives with the use of force. And so that's going to take resolve. It's going to take investment across all of our militaries, and certainly I think Australia is going to play a pivotal role there. I think Japan will play a very important role here as well. I think that the increased capabilities of the self-defense force in Japan, that's an important initiative. But I think also now these nascent partnerships with other countries in the region as well. I mean, hopefully in a post-Duterte Philippines, a more rational leader is there who recognizes the Philippines' interests do clearly align with ours. And then, of course, there are tremendous opportunities in Vietnam and other places. So I think the trends for us are not in a positive direction diplomatically, and then militarily we just you know what I think about as a metaphor, and I don't want to over emphasize this, but Japan's strategy in World War II was to conduct a centripetal offensive, seize the inner island chain, and just make it too darn costly for the U.S. to penetrate that island chain. They didn't think that America had the stomach for it, right? So they miscalculated. We did have the stomach for it. But I think if you think about that Japanese World War II concept, and then you just flip it, that was oriented outward, right, toward Hawaii and the United States. If you orient a concept like that inward, China has a real problem on their hands, right? And you know, they're just destroying ecosystems in the South China Sea. They're militarizing those islands. But hey, those are islands. If you have capable missile forces, they look like targets to me. You know, so I think that with the right suite of capabilities, the right strategic concept, the right partnerships and alliances, that we will be able to maintain our deterrent capability. But you know what you can't predict is what Xi Jinping will do. Look at what he's doing opposite of Taiwan right now, with the marshaling of missiles, the increasingly threatening language. And you know, what if Xi Jinping thinks he's winning? And what if the PLA is believing their own propaganda right now, right? And you know, I think of the Hainan Island incident years ago, with an overly aggressive pilot. I mean, I think that these are all flashpoints, dangerous flashpoints right now, across the Indo-Pacific region.
You mentioned Taiwan there. I might bring in at this point Peter Jennings, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Peter?
I really want to ask a question that follows directly from what you've been saying to Jim about Taiwan. We've seen over a number of years, China has progressively tried to narrow the space for other countries to engage with Taiwan. And then in recent months, we've seen an aggressive ramping up of Chinese military exercising, infringing Taiwanese airspace and sea space, and a rejection of the middle line in the Straits as being an area to observe. And we've seen a significant ramping up of Chinese rhetoric about incorporating Taiwan back, as they would put it, into the mainland. Do you think this gives rise to a short-term risk? I'm thinking of, you know, perhaps an uncertain presidential election outcome through to June of next year, when it's the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Communist Party. What's your view about the prospects that we might actually face, you know, in a matter of weeks, a really serious military crisis across the Straits?
I think the chances are high, Peter. I really do, and that's why I think it's important that we do everything we can to deter that conflict. I think what you know, what the Trump administration has done with, you know, the 4 speeches that were given recently, the making public of the 6 assurances to Taiwan, you know, the arms sales to Taiwan, I think are immensely important. I think the qualitative improvements within the Taiwanese military, as well as the acquisition of some of these important defensive capabilities, I think they're in a race, you know, and they ought to be pursuing this, obviously, with a high degree of urgency. You know, I am concerned about it. I think the milestones you laid out, including the 100th anniversary next year, and I would also say that, you know, before 2022, certainly this is a period of danger, which is before the next Communist Party Congress. And I think when Xi Jinping, you know, could actually become, you know, the next Mao and leader for life in China. And he has made this obviously his personal priority from the beginning. So Peter, I mean, I know you follow this yourself. I mean, would you mind sharing your thoughts on this with us as well?
Oh, well, thanks, General. I mean, look, I am concerned about the risks of a crisis across the Straits. I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily a full-on amphibious assault, but I do think that China will attempt to sort of sneak up to putting more pressure on Taiwan through a blockade, by applying more economic pressure on Taipei, saying to Taipei, well, look, you know, if you agree to some timetable for incorporation, we'll be able to sort of, you know, open up economic engagement a bit more. I think there's also a very significant Communist Party 5th column that could be activated inside Taiwan that could create the impression of patriotic citizens calling for unification. And it seems to me that China has the option to try to push this, you know, really aggressively, taking every small step and then waiting to see, is the United States going to respond? What will the region do? And if it looks like there is a distracted America for whatever reasons, well, maybe China will then take the next step and the next. And it does seem to me, General, that this is not a problem necessarily 5 years down the track. It's really starting already, and it could get significant momentum as we get past your own presidential election, and then that 100th anniversary, which is actually a very significant thing for Xi Jinping in terms of what he's promised the Chinese people.
Yes. Well, thanks, Peter. I agree completely. And if they can accomplish their objectives below the threshold of what elicits U.S. response, either because of U.S. being distracted or the means that they employ, that are, I think, in many ways similar to Russian new generation warfare that was on display in the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine. I think you're highlighting exactly the risks that we have to keep in mind.
I might then leave these shores just temporarily and go to Oliver Hartwich in Wellington. Oliver Hartwich is the director of the New Zealand initiative. Oliver?
Thank you, Nick, and greetings from Wellington, General McMaster. We've had, of course, a big shift in US policy towards China over the last few years, but we've seen a corresponding shift, of course, in New Zealand as well under the headline Pacific Reset. And that was driven by our Foreign Minister, Winston Peters. And of course, we had elections last Saturday, and Winston Peters is out of Parliament. So New Zealand will get a new Foreign Minister. And I wonder what that means for the Pacific Reset and for New Zealand's role in the Pacific, especially vis-a-vis China. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on New Zealand's role in the wider Pacific, and whether you might want to comment on the New Zealand elections results in this respect.
Well, I think the role is immensely important in connection with the New Zealand's effort and ability to convene other countries from across the region, and to view the competition with China correctly, and not as a U.S.-China problem, but to make it clear, hey, this is a kind of a free world. This is a free world China problem, and we have to work more effectively together. The U.S. ambassador there in New Zealand, I know, has been very active. He was a great partner for me when I was in the White House. And I think one of the ways in which he was effective is he would convene the ambassadors of like-minded countries with New Zealand government officials to have discussions about, the threat from Chinese economic coercion under One Belt, One Road, for example, and to generate ideas on how we can work more effectively together. So I think New Zealand is a country whose voice is very strong and loud. Based on the fact that you can clarify, I think the three myths associated with the competition with China. Hey, that it's a U.S.-China problem. Okay, well, how is that the case when you look at the range of Chinese aggression oriented at other countries? The second is that there's not international cooperation on it, right? That it's just the U.S. going it alone, and Xi Jinping's acting out just because Donald Trump is so darn mean, And I think to highlight the degree of international cooperation that's already ongoing, I think New Zealand's supposed to be super strong there as well. And then also to assure the world, because of New Zealand's long and historic prioritization of peace and mediation, that we're not facing a false dilemma between either accommodating the Communist Party or a disastrous war, right? I mean, this is the so-called Thucydides trap thesis. I mean, there's actually a lot of ground in between that, right? And there are arenas of competition, we could re-enter. So I think New Zealand plays, kind of a pivotal role from just its geographic location and where it sits across the region, but also I think from a diplomatic perspective. And so I think that the problem is now pretty much inescapable, for all of our countries, and I think that's the role that New Zealand's already playing and will continue to play. But any thoughts from New Zealand on this, from your perspective?
Well, I was just going to say that you may be the one of the few people who actually will miss Winston Peters when he's gone. And it's a different matter, of course, when you're talking about Winston Peters in an international context rather than a domestic one. I think domestically speaking, Winston Peters didn't achieve much, but in foreign policy terms, he was a remarkably clear voice. And I don't quite see that after the change of government, we will see the same kind of clarity in our international approach vis-a-vis China that Winston Peters brought to it, because I think he's got a long history of actually dealing with the United States and various security advisors going back to Condoleezza Rice, really. And I'm not quite sure whether we'll have anything similar in the new Labour government under Jacinda Ardern that we're going to get without Winston Peters?
Well, I think the study that was done on Chinese influence in New Zealand, gosh, about a year ago now, is really important. I think educating the public about it. I think John Garneau is the one who broke ground on this in Australia, really did a brilliant job. So I think maybe educating the public is the best way to make sure that we maintain our resolve, right, and don't allow China again, to use the strategy of co-option, coercion, and concealment. And concealment is really concealing these aggressive acts. Oh, it's just normal business practices, right? It's really not.
One final question from Tom Switzer, the director of the Centre for Independent Studies.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you, General. Let me put to you the arguments of Professors John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt from Chicago and Harvard universities, respectively. And I have to say, I think this is increasingly becoming a widespread view in many circles in Australia. How can the United States be so focused on East Asia in the face of a rising China threat when A, it remains still heavily engaged in Europe 30 years since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet communism, and the Persian Gulf when America is virtually energy independent? Surely there are limits on America's power in a world that is no longer unipolar and at a time when America faces pressing domestic priorities. How can America be so engaged in Europe and the Persian Gulf and China in that environment? General.
Well, I mean, there is just a fact to cite, which is that our the numbers and size of U.S. forces that are employed overseas are at historic lows, going back to the end of World War II. That these commitments are sustainable, and I think that what has to be the most important argument to make is really what is at stake in competitions and challenges associated with these military deployments. But what is at stake as well from a diplomatic perspective, a political perspective, because as you know, many of these military deployments are really important because of the political effect that they have in terms of the cohesion of alliance, the ability to encourage others to share, collective defense burdens, which should be viewed as kind of a bargain rather than having to do it all of ourselves. So I think that what our leaders have not done effectively in recent years is explain, what's in it for American citizens, right? What are you getting out of your armed forces positioned in Europe, for example, or operating in the Middle East or in South Asia or across the Indo-Pacific? And so I think that's a communication problem. I take this on directly in the book, the so-called realist school. I also, if you're super interested in this, I wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs two issues ago entitled "Rebutting Retrenchment," and what I see within the so-called realist school is really a bunch of romantics, who have a romantic view of the world, in which they believe that our disengagement from these problem sets is an unmitigated good. I believe that this is an extreme version of what I call in the book strategic narcissism, because really what they claim is that others have no aspirations, they have no agency except in reaction to us, right? So if we disengage from the Middle East, there wouldn't be a jihadist terrorist problem, right? If we weren't on the Korean Peninsula, you wouldn't have North Korea pursuing nuclear weapons. If we weren't in Europe and if we didn't advocate for the expansion of the EU and the expansion of NATO countries to involve membership by former Warsaw Pact countries, Russia wouldn't be as aggressive as they are. So this is a school that really blames us for all of the actions of our adversaries, and I think it's profoundly narcissistic and arrogant. It's an ideology, I think, that portrays itself as one of greater humility, but it is one that I think is profoundly arrogant in that it doesn't grant agency to our rivals, adversaries, and enemies.
Before I let you go, I know you've gone out of your way and done so very well in this book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, not to talk about politics, but, well, hey, you know Donald Trump, you worked with him, and you talk in the book about his capacities to surprise. Is he going to surprise us on Saturday week?
I'll tell you, Nick, I'm the worst guy to ask, right? I mean, so I took an oath to join our army when I entered West Point at age 17. I had read a biography of George Marshall when I was in high school, and I followed his example of I never voted. I voted for the first time last week with an absentee ballot. But I'm not going to tell anybody how I voted, obviously. I'm probably the worst person to talk about U.S. domestic politics. I mean, I'm disappointed, obviously, in the lack of substance in the campaign. You know, the debate was a debacle. Foreign policy hasn't even come up. You know? And you know, when I think about the question about U.S. retrenchment and withdrawal, I'm tempted to paraphrase the quote that's attributed to Trotsky, that may or may not be true, that you may not be interested in foreign policy, but foreign policy is interested in you. And I think if we learned anything from COVID, is that the problems that develop overseas, can only be dealt with maybe at an exorbitant price once they reach your shores. And I think that's the argument, for sustained engagement, to kind of continue on the theme that Tom introduced. But hey, what a privilege to be with you. I guess we'll see what happens in a couple of weeks. I just want World Cup rugby to come back. I hope that the Six Nations are on schedule. I'm not sure. I don't know what's going on in your hemisphere, but that's part of a life that I miss right now. Anyway.
And all the best with your book, HR.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you so much. Thanks, April. Thanks to all of you. What a privilege it was to be with you, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Beautiful.